Welcome to the Living Well Church podcast, and thanks for tuning in today. Our mission as a church is to help people find faith in Jesus and a life of purpose and hope. You're about to watch a message that will challenge you, inspire you, encourage you, and most of all, point you to Jesus and the life of purpose and hope He has planned for you. So lean in and enjoy, and let God speak into your life.
Well, good morning. Anyone else warm? Is it just me? I can see lots of fanning going on. But it's really good to be with you this morning and to be able to share something from God's Word on such a happy occasion after the dedication of Beatrice. I actually heard a pretty funny story about baptism and dedication fairly recently. There was a family of four, Christian family, and they'd been to church on a Sunday for a dedication service. And then they'd gone home, and it was a mum and a dad, two sons, one's 8 years old, one is 5, and they live on quite a rough estate. And as they head home, they make their usual route, dodging the massive potholes in their street to get back to their house. And not long after they'd got home, the rain started to come down, and it really started to hammer down. And the two boys said, "Mum, can we go out and play in the puddles?" It was one of their favourite things to do, was go and play in the puddles. And she said, "Okay, you can go, put your raincoats on, you can go outside, but make sure you stay where I can see you in the window here from the kitchen." So the two boys go out and they're playing quite nicely together for a while. And then to the mother's horror, she looks up and she sees the 8-year-old son grabbing the scruff of the neck of the 5-year-old son and ramming his head into one of these puddles. And she just screams and runs crazy out into the street, grabs the older son and says, "What on earth do you think you're doing? What are you doing to your little brother?" And he said, "Don't worry, Mummy, I was just playing church. I was baptizing him in the name of the Father and the Son and in the Holy Ghost." Yeah, it's bad. Thank you for laughing. I appreciate it. Well, hopefully you'll forgive that terrible joke at the start of this sermon, but it is really good to be here. And I think Marcus made an important distinction earlier on, that what we've done this morning with Beatrice is not make her a Christian, but this is an act of dedication. But I think it's kind of a two-way act of dedication. On the one hand, Phil and Gemma are dedicating the child to God. They're dedicating B to God. But also Phil and Gemma are making a dedication as well, that they're going to bring her up in the right way and give her the very best foundation for a future relationship with God when she's old enough to make that decision. And that's fantastic. And what I want to talk about this morning is basically the broader importance of a life of dedication in the Christian walk. Because we're actually called to live full lives of dedication. And what I find really interesting is that in Christian circles, it's a no-brainer that you would baptize your child or you would dedicate your child based on which denomination of the church you're part of. You know, it's an immediate reaction when you have a baby that we want to say that when we've been given this most precious of gifts, very early on in the life of that child, we want to dedicate that to God. But also what's interesting is that people who maybe wouldn't even describe themselves as Christians also tend to do this quite frequently. So people that themselves would say, "I have no relationship with God necessarily, but I still want to have my child baptized." And I think that's interesting because it's almost saying, I want to give them the best possible start in life. I want to do the right thing by this child. And that really, I think, is quite interesting from somebody that maybe themselves wouldn't even say they necessarily strive to have a relationship with God. But what's interesting, again, both in Christian circles and in non-Christian circles, is that we commit that most important thing, that most important gift that we could ever receive. Our immediate reaction is to dedicate that thing to God. But actually, there are things in our lives that we probably find much harder to dedicate than even that most important gift that we could ever receive. But we are called as Christians to live out a whole lifestyle of dedication. And what I want to do this morning is just look for a short while at a passage in Genesis, which is the first book of the Old Testament in the Bible. And we're going to read from verses 1 to 12 of that passage. And this talks about an experience that a man called Abraham goes through with God. And I'm reading from the New International Version. It says this: "Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, 'Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you.' Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and he saw the place in the distance. He said to his servant, "Stay here with the donkey, while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the 2 of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father, "Father, yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and he took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." "Here I am," he replied. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." So here we find Abraham in the most desperate of situations, the worst possible scenario a parent can find themselves in. And if you're reading this for the first time, you could easily think, this is God being incredibly cruel here. Even pretending that he wanted Abraham to carry through this act is incredibly cruel. But actually, it's important to know that God never ever intended Abraham to go through with this, first of all. But also for Abraham and for us, there are some really powerful lessons to learn in what happens here in these series of events. And for any parent, this would be an awful situation. But I think it's important for us to understand some of the context of Abraham's background to truly understand just how big and difficult a decision this would have been for him. If we go back to chapter 12 of Genesis, God asks Abraham to leave his home, so to leave the land of his father, to leave his relatives behind, because God has promised him a new land. He's promised that he's going to make him into a great nation in another land. So at 75 years old, Abraham uproots and he travels 400 miles from Haran, which is in present-day Turkey, and he travels to the land of Canaan, which today represents the areas of Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. And this in itself is a big test of Abraham's dedication. Not many 75-year-olds would just uproot themselves and travel 400 miles in that nature. And in this particular time period, leaving your father's land was no small matter. This was a big deal, to uproot yourself and leave your family behind. You were walking away from your inheritance, you were walking away from your history, and it was often seen as a hugely disrespectful and traitorous act to walk away from your family like that. So in a way, Abraham shows a massive example of his dedication to God in uprooting and following his instructions in that situation. Then later on in chapter 15, another conversation takes place between God and Abraham, in which God tells him that even in their old age, he and his wife Sarah are going to conceive a child who will be their heir and will carry their line forward. And up to this point, in their old age, they'd never managed to have children. And God stays true to his word. And later in chapter 21, we read about the birth of Isaac to Sarah and Abraham. But in the interim period, when they thought they couldn't have children, Sarah had convinced Abraham to sleep with one of the slave girls to give them an heir and give their family a chance of progressing forwards. But now with the 2 sons, with 2 different mothers, we have quite a complicated situation. And Sarah demands that Ishmael, the son from the slave girl, should be sent away with his mother, away from Abraham and Sarah, which distresses Abraham. But God says, no, do what Sarah asks, because it's going to be through Isaac that I'm going to bring about your offspring and your legacy. So that's quite a long story short, but we end up here at the testing of Abraham in a situation where, for 2 reasons, this would have been a particularly horrible decision for Abraham. Firstly, because he would have already felt like he'd given so much, that he'd shown himself to be dedicated, that he'd shown himself to be faithful to what God was asking him to do by traveling 400 miles in his old age to a new land. But also, God had promised him not just that he was going to have 1 son, but actually that he was going to have descendants that would be as numerous as the stars. And having gone from having 2 sons, one of whom's been sent away, the one who God promised the line would come from, he's now asking him to sacrifice. So every fibre of Abraham's being must have wanted to say no in that situation. It must have been so confusing. But God, you've said this is what's going to happen, and now you're asking me to give that thing up, through which your promise is going to come. You know, normally in this situation, it would have been a bull or it would have been a lamb that would have been sacrificed. Yet how willingly would Abraham have given thousands of bulls or thousands of lambs to spare his son Isaac in this situation? And I think sometimes that's quite poignant for us. We're often very happy to give lots of the thing that we're comfortable to give over maybe just the smallest part of that thing that we really struggle to hand over to God. You know, God, you can have as much of my money as you want. I can be so generous with my money, but my time is precious to me. I need that for myself. I need that for my family. Or maybe, God, you can have as much of my time as you want. You can have every evening of the week, but my money is my security, and it's how I protect my family and look after my family, so that I can't dedicate to you. But here's the thing. For God to bring about the destiny that he had planned for Abraham, he needed to know that Abraham was all in. He needed to know that Abraham was fully dedicated to what he was going to call him to do. Abraham had shown a lot already. You know, he'd shown that his dedication for God went further than his love for his father and his love for his hometown. He'd shown that his dedication went further than his concern for his own welfare or health to travel that far as an old man. He even showed that his dedication to God went further than his thoughts about his own reputation. But actually, for God to know that he was all in, he needed to know that his dedication went further than even his love for his own son. And even now, you know, after 20-odd years as a Christian and having heard this passage many times, it still blows my mind that Abraham was going to go through with this. It blows my mind that he was actually going to do it. And it humbles me because it makes me think about some of the things that I know I hold back from God, which fall into total insignificance against somebody's only son. You know, when I was younger, money was one of the things I really struggled to dedicate. I was always very good with time. You know, even as a young boy, I used to give a lot of time to church. I would serve every Sunday in church. I'd be at the prayer meetings. I'd be at the youth meetings. I helped run the youth club when I was old enough. Yeah, almost every day of the week, I was involved in some capacity with church, and that was fine. But when I was at the very early stages of my career and I wasn't making much money, I really struggled to dedicate that to God fully. And I struggled to let that go. And I was brilliant at making excuses. Oh God, you know, the economy's not great at the moment. My pound, it's not going as far as it used to, so you're going to have to accept a little bit less than usual this month. Or, oh God, that holiday, I need that holiday because, you know, I've been working so hard for you these last few months and I'm exhausted and I need to replenish. So you're going to get a bit less this month, but I'll give you more next month, which never happened. And this went on for quite a long time until one day God convicted me so hard that I needed to get this right and I needed to put that thing in the right place of priority in my life. And so from that point onwards, I said, you know, whatever happens, God, you're going to get the first X amount of my paycheck every month. And even if it means I end up going into the red at the end of the month, that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to commit to that. And I can honestly tell you, since that day, God has never, ever left me short. Any month. And he's actually blessed me in a way that's enabled me to give far more than I thought I would ever be able to give in those younger days. But for so long, I held that thing back. For so long, I thought I was a better steward of that thing than God could be. And it's crazy to think that we can fool ourselves like that sometimes. And we can think, actually, we are better at handling things than God can be. You know, God, you don't understand why I'm so insecure about this thing. You don't understand why I'm so protective of this thing. But yet our first instinct with even our child, with something as precious as a child, our first instinct is to say, God, I dedicate this to you. I want you to have your way in this child's life. I want to dedicate to be the best Christian parent I can be. That just doesn't make any sense, does it? If you asked any parent to rank any of those things, whether it's money, whether it's time, whether it's insecurities, whether it's pride, if you asked them to rank any of those things against their child, they'd surely come far lower down the priority list. And yet we find those things harder to dedicate sometimes than even our own children. So I challenge you today to figure out what those things are in your life. And they'll all be different for all of us. They'll be different to the things that I struggle with. They'll be different to the people to your left and your right. But what are those things that you know you've never managed to fully hand over and fully dedicate to God? One of the things that I think often gets overlooked in this passage, and I've heard it preached on many times over the years, is actually the response of Isaac himself in this situation. Because I think I used to read this, and I used to think that Isaac was probably a young boy, and he was probably of an age where, if he needed to, Abraham could have overpowered him and forced him onto the altar. But I don't actually think that's the case when we look into it a bit deeper. The original text actually uses a word for boy in this passage, which is quite ambiguous. It's a word that can mean anything from a baby to a young man, actually. We know for a fact that Isaac is younger than 37 because Sarah gave birth to him at 90 and died after this event at the age of 127. We also know for sure that some time had passed between the boy being weaned, which usually happened between the ages of 2 and 5 in these times, and this event. So there is a chance that he could have been a young boy. But I think when we look at the situation more closely, it's unlikely, because this was a minimum 3-day journey. We're told that on the 3rd day, Abraham looks up and he sees the place in the distance. So it suggests he probably wasn't a very young boy if he was able to undertake a journey of that length and care for his elderly father at the same time. But also, we're told in the text that it's Isaac that carries the wood from the place that they stop to the place of the sacrifice. And we're told explicitly it's quite some distance away. And enough wood for a burnt offering like this wouldn't have been a particularly light load. So we can probably assume that he was at least a healthy teenager at this point. And surely, therefore, old enough and strong enough to overpower his father, who was 100 years plus at this time. But actually, Isaac doesn't resist at all. We read nothing about him fighting back or resisting or fighting for his life. He trusts his father, even to that horrible point where it would have dawned on him that in fact he was the sacrifice. And the dedication that Isaac shows shouldn't be overlooked in this passage. But actually, his dedication to his father and his trust in his father comes as a direct result of his father's trust and dedication in God. And I believe it's the same with B today. I believe B will learn about trust and dedication from the way that her parents dedicate their lives to God. And I believe if they see an Abraham heart in Phil and Gemma, then she will much more likely adopt an Isaac heart in return. Because lives of dedication, they don't just give God the platform to move powerfully in our situations and our circumstances, but they also have a big impact on the people around us. When I see the dedication of a world-class athlete like Mo Farah, I look at the way that he dedicates himself in his training, and he dedicates himself in what he eats and what he puts his body through and what he avoids in order to achieve his goals. It actually inspires me. It inspires me to want to make changes to my own life and to want to dedicate to things more. And I believe it's the same with our faith. I think if we can illuminate with that level of dedication, if people can see that that is consistent through the way that we live our lives, then it will generate change in people. And people will see something in us that causes a reaction. Because we can ultimately dedicate every single child to God. And it's a great thing to do. But if we do that, and if that attitude with which we dedicate the child doesn't permeate the rest of our lives, then surely it's meaningless. And you might be here this morning, and you might be a guest of Phil and Gemma's. Maybe this is your first time in church. And maybe you're wondering, why would I even want to dedicate my life to God? Why would I even want to do that? Maybe for you, baby dedication is just a tradition here in the UK. It's a nice thing to do. It's a good excuse for a celebration. But that's kind of where the meaning ends. But actually, this situation that we read about in Genesis with Abraham and Isaac is pointing us towards a much bigger event that happens later in the Bible. Many books and many chapters later between God and his son, Jesus. God asked Abraham to give up his son, but he never intended him to go through with it. Whereas later in the Bible, we read about God not just committing to, but following through with the sacrifice of his son Jesus on the cross, not just for Abraham, but for every single one of us. There's a pretty well-known passage in the Bible, found in the New Testament book of John, chapter 3, and it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, so that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but will have eternal life." You see, God wanted Abraham to dedicate himself because God was already so dedicated to Abraham. Just like he is so fully dedicated and so fully committed to you today. The Bible teaches us that the world is a broken place. And whether you're a Christian or not, whether you regularly attend church or not, I think you'd struggle to disagree with that when we look around what's going on in this world. From the awful terrorist activity that seems to be happening on a daily basis to even the state of our own government in one of the most civilized countries in the world. What's pretty clear is that we as the human race do not have the answers. We're incredibly incapable of dealing with the mess that this world is in. But fortunately for us, God recognized that. And long ago, he sent Jesus to be the answer for us. And in the form of this perfect, sinless sacrifice of his son, he found a way to reconcile the broken, sinful man like me with a perfect and holy God. And if you're hearing this for the first time today, then I want you to know, if you go away knowing nothing else, that God is so fully dedicated to you. He's so fully committed to you. So much so that he would send even his only son to die on the cross. And we're told in the Bible that the experience was so awful for Jesus on that cross that even he, as the Son of God, and as the Bible teaches us, a very part of God, he cried out and said, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" Which means, why have you abandoned me? Imagine hearing that from your own son. Why have you abandoned me in my moment of greatest need? But God thought you, and God thought I, was worth that cost to put his son on that cross. So today, whether you are a Christian or not, we've all got things to consider when it comes to dedication. If you've already made that decision to follow Jesus, then I challenge you today to be honest with yourselves about the areas of your lives that you know you've still not fully given over to him. The bits that you're still just clinging on to, that you think you can deal with better. And I'd encourage you to be inspired by Abraham and to be inspired by what God was able to achieve through his life because of that attitude of full dedication. And today, maybe if you wouldn't call yourself a Christian and you wouldn't say you have any kind of relationship with God right now, then I'd just ask you what the point of today was. What was the point in Phil and Gemma coming and making such a public demonstration of dedicating little B? Was it just ceremony? Was it just a nice thing to do? Or is this maybe all part of something so much bigger? And I'll finish with this thought. If it's not God, then what is your life dedicated to? Maybe it's work, maybe it's your boss, maybe it's your family, maybe it is money. But is that really enough to entrust everything to? Is that really enough to dedicate every single thing that you are to? You know, what I love about Abraham was just how much God was able to achieve because of that heart. It was actually from Abraham that Jesus came. It was from that line that we got Jesus. And you know, in that moment when he was laying Isaac on the cross, he must have thought, I'm giving up everything here. He must have thought, I'm about to lose everything. But in fact, in that heart of dedication, he found everything. And God was able to do so much through his life. So I'll leave you with that challenge. But if you'd like to chat with me any more after the service about anything I've said this morning, then just come and find me, and I'd love to talk it through with you. Thank you.